Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Whole Reason podcast, where we are trying to create a community where we pursue spiritual and intellectual maturity, not just one or the other. I'm your host, Dan Sinclair. You can see my credentials down below. Today's episode is about 8 principles for using reason to test faith. I know 8's a lot, but the underlying idea is that true belief must be tested by reason. You cannot leave reason out from your faith. Here's our overview here. We're going to talk about last week just briefly. Maybe I'll leave that out because we're getting kind of long. We'll talk about today's topic, which is supposedly 15 minutes, but probably twice that. We're going to have a book of the week, a closing prayer, and then my favorite section, Confessions of a Podcaster, where I talk about the difficulties in doing a podcast for those of you who want to do your own. Well, just to review what we've been doing, we've been talking about the 4 main methods of epistemology. That is the 4 ways or tools that we have to determine what is true. We started with empiricism, which is basically the scientific endeavor of using using observation and experimentation to determine what is true. Now that works really well in the physical realm, but in the non-physical realm where there are, for instance, in history or philosophy or mathematics, where we have non-material realities like the existence of God or ethics, empiricism must take a backseat to our other methods that are better suited to exploring truth in these areas, and that is reason, experience, and authority. So we've been talking about reason and the application of reason to faith for a few weeks, and so we're going to continue today. All right, now last week we talked about the 4 classical arguments for the existence of God, and I won't review these, but check out last week's podcast if you want to know more about that. All right, well, today we're going to talk about 8 principles of how and why we should apply reason to our faith. All right, now 5 of them come from Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne, and then we've got 3 more. So I'm just going to read them quickly, and then we'll go through each one in a little bit more depth. So the first one is reason must be used to determine if God is imaginary or real. Reason must be used to determine if God is imaginary or real. The second is that evangelism must include rational arguments. The third, integrity demands that we inspect our faith with reason. The fourth is that true belief is really rationally justified belief. That is, if we apply reason to our pursuit, we will arrive at the truth, even if reason cannot answer every question. Number 5, it is vital to know the answer to the existence of God. It is important to every individual to know the answer to this, not just for personal reasons, but for practical reasons, not just for the life to come, but for this life. All right, there are 3 more principles that we don't get from Richard Swinburne. One is that rational faith is virtuous, but if you don't apply faith, irrational faith is a vice. Number 7, revelation, which is not reason, but is experience and authority, is a valid form of knowledge, but still should be subjected to the examinations of reason. And lastly, philosophy, or the employment of reason, is primarily used to support or reject contentious claims, which the existence of God is. So we ought to use it in our pursuit of the truth of God and of objective morals and similar non-material realities. Well, we're going to be talking through the first 5 points by Richard Swinburne. So who is Richard Swinburne? Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher who's still alive. He's emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford, and in general, just a really bright fellow. And he is of enough importance that his work will be talked about after he is gone, just like many of the great philosophers that have made contributions, good, notable contributions to philosophy. All right. Well, let's go to point number one, which is reason must be used to determine if God is imaginary or real. So I want us to hear what Richard Swinburne has to say about this. You can only have a personal relationship to God in Christ if it is true that God exists. Now, he says this in his wonderful book, The Coherence of Theism, where, of course, he is arguing that theism, that is a belief in God, not necessarily the Christian God, but just the creator and maximally great being, is reasonable and consistent with logic. Now, I want to say something about using reason in your approach to God, and that is that there's kind of a divide in the Christian church where some people emphasize emotion and the kind of conscious experience of God, and on the other side we have the academics who like to study in 5-point outlines. And a lot of times they don't meet. Now, a lot of times they actually do. And in fact, what's happened over time is, like, the charismatics have recognized that they need a systematic theology to keep from spinning off into weird theology, which, of course, some parts of the charismatic church are still doing. And so they have kind of gravitated towards systematic theology. And to their benefit, a lot of the more staid and kind of formalized churches are exploring contemporary worship and a real living faith that involves more than just the mind. All right, so it's good to see both of those. And what is important is that the object of our faith is true and existent, and we should use reason to the best of our ability to eliminate false claims about God. All right, so that's why we want to use reason to help us eliminate false claims. It can't answer everything, but it is part of our responsibility as whole people who develop in head and heart, not one or the other, and spin off into some either dead religion or weird experiences that we misinterpret. Well, here's point number two. Evangelism must include rational arguments. Now, there are four types, main types of evangelism. The first is evidential, the second is classical philosophical, the third is what they call cumulative case work, and the fourth is presuppositional. Now, presuppositional is different from all the rest, and the reason is the presuppositionalist says intellectual argument cannot create faith. What creates faith is when the heart, the intuition, hears and recognizes the truth. So we hold up the truth, we preach the truth that Christ died for us and rose from the dead, and we expect people to believe that in their heart, and that kind of goes around any wrong thinking or defenses in the mind. And I think there is some truth to that, but that does not mean that we should not employ reason and argument in our approach to faith and evangelism. Now, with regard to the presuppositional approach and why we should use reason, here's a nice quote from Tim Keller, who recently passed and was a great author and pastor. Apologetics cannot create faith. Okay, so he's admitting that the presuppositional approach has some merit, but it can support faith, remove obstacles to faith, and strengthen the faith that exists. You know, St. Anselm said that what the life of faith is faith-seeking understanding. That is, we may believe in the heart, but we're asking the mind to work hard and catch up and refine and prove or correct our faith. That's the relationship we're looking for. So evangelism must include rational arguments. Now, I'm going to briefly explain what each of these types of evangelism are, just so you kind of understand what they are. Evidential apologetics basically just uses evidence for the claims of Christianity, like historical evidence, archaeological evidence, scientific evidence, or even philosophical arguments. Although classic apologetics or classical philosophical approaches use the arguments we talked about last week, the cosmological, ontological, axiological, teleological arguments for the existence of God. And those have stood the test of time. It's not that they have been, proved false or debunked. They haven't been. They may not be conclusive to everyone, and they're still even being debated and refined in philosophical journals today. but they're not gone because they've stood the test of time and have enough strength in them to remain standing under scrutiny, which is great. All right, the third type is the cumulative case apologetics. And this is where we take a bunch of arguments from, like we talked about in the evidential thing, but we stack them. Now, one of my favorite living atheist philosophers is Graham Oppy, and we'll talk about one of his books later. But he makes a really good argument warning us against unjustified cumulative case arguments. And that is, if the points don't have some sort of rational or logical connection between them, like for this to be true, this has to be true, and these two coordinate. If they're just independent points, stacking them is not really a valid method unless there's a reason to stack them to build the cumulative case. So not every cumulative argument is a good one. And Christians, we should probably learn that. All right, well, let's move on to the third point. And that is that integrity, personal integrity, demands that you and I inspect our faith with reason. Let's listen to Richard Swinburne again. It is no bad thing to check your claim by considering whether others' objections provide you with grounds for sharing their skepticism. See, he admits that all of us have times when we are mistaken about closely held opinions and beliefs. So in the interest of integrity, we must use reason to evaluate what we believe, because a lot of us need correction in our thinking or broadening of our thinking. We may have only one principle that applies to the situation we're talking about, but the Bible may have 2 or 3 or 4, and it's not that the thing we believe is wrong, it's just incomplete. And when somebody says, well, what about? We can't just parrot the same answer if it actually doesn't really answer it. We need to take those objections and build a better understanding of reality, including spiritual. And we're talking about spiritual reality and moral reality and theological reality, not just whether or not apples exist. All right, here's point number 4. True belief is rationally justified belief. Now, what this really means in Swinburne's philosophy is that reason leads us to the truth, even if it cannot explain everything. If we are pursuing reason, despite reason's limitations, it will lead us to the truth. And if we are not employing reason, it's more likely that we will not arrive at what is true and have almost no way to parse out the lies except for personal subjective experience, which is another important method, but it is not complete on its own. Our beliefs are quite possibly untrue if they cannot be rationally justified. This is not about empirical evidence, but rational arguments using logic and historical evidences. So you can't measure the existence of God any more than you can measure morality. But that doesn't mean you cannot make reasoned assumptions and arguments about the objective reality of both God and morals. Additionally, true beliefs, that is, our assumptions about reality, lead to true knowledge. If our beliefs are invalid, we will have trouble finding true knowledge as well. All right, if the things we believe are incorrect, we're not going to arrive at truths except for the hard way, by bumping into reality, right? All right, well, I just want to say that, again, just like with empiricism, reason has limits and things that it will bump into, which doesn't mean that the things you're investigating are false. It may mean that you need more and better methods and more data to figure out what's true. So using reason to lead you to the truth, especially about spiritual matters, does not mean that you're not going to bump into mysteries like the Trinity or paradoxes like the dual truths of predestination and free will. You know, I talk to a lot of atheists online, and one of the things I hear very often is that these two concepts, which the Bible teach are both true, cannot be true. They're logically, they're exclusive of one another. They can't both be true. But the thing is not only is there a mystery here, but just an appeal to mystery doesn't mean we can't understand it. It means we don't understand it yet. And I want to use this example, not predestination and free will, which is a philosophical concept, but the biological analog, which is biological determinism and free will. Now, what that means is if you and I have no separate mind or spirit or soul, but we are just physical entities, we're bodies, right? And all the things like our mind are just emergent properties of the physical realm. It basically means that even if you feel like you are choosing, you really aren't. You're just responding to stimuli. We're just a biological machine, and that is called in biology, or the kind of a philosophy realm of biology, biological determinism. That is, that we don't determine things, our biology does. That's like predestination. Well, in that case, what they would then conclude is, because they assume that there's no separate mind, that means free will is an illusion. You may feel like you're choosing freely, and of course, none of us chooses entirely independent of the inputs of our biology, of the things we've experienced. But the question is, are you really choosing, or is that just an illusion? So the debate between biological determinism and the experience of free will lies in the gray area between true mystery and logical contradiction. Which is it, a contradiction or a true mystery? And I'm going to argue that reason has its limits, and in this case, it's a true mystery. See, our lack of free will under determinism seems contradictory to our experience of free will. How can we have any kind of agency if everything is determined not by us, not by me, the person, but just by my biology? And what I would say is that critics argue that this is a logical contradiction, and that any meaningful form of free will appears logically incompatible with the idea that we have biology. That we only have our physical biology and not a separate mind or spirit. And to some extent, I agree. But the question is, do we have a separate mind or spirit? And if so, then perhaps independent choice can be made. All right. So true belief, all I'm saying is that we are applying reason to what we believe, but sometimes it's going to bump up against such mysteries as the Trinity or predestination. And that doesn't mean that these things are not so. But we still should apply reason to eliminate lies and pretenders. Okay? It's not going to answer everything, just like empiricism. Number 5, it is vital to know the answer to the existence of God. You know, some people consider the existence of God as inconsequential, and that the real life or possible future life consequences of belief or unbelief are unimportant. But I'm saying that they are monumental to both ourselves and for humanity. See, there are practical reasons that believing in God or not believing in God, there are practical results in history and in humanity that we can foresee coming if we're objectively looking at the logical sequence of ideas that flow from it. But there could also be eternal reasons, or eternal loss, or the possibility of risk if we are incorrect. And of course, that's what Pascal's wager is about. Well, what do you mean by the pragmatic reasons of belief or unbelief? Well, let me say something interesting. They've done studies where they've looked at the happiness of men and women in marriage, or even the sex lives of women. Recently, I've seen these studies, and I'm sorry I didn't quote them here, but I can add them into the description, where Christian women seem to be happier than those who are not. Well, that is a pragmatic outcome. Now, one of my favorite podcasters, Scott Adams, who is not a believer, he's a skeptic and atheist and agnostic. He says, sometimes I wish I could believe, because I look at the fruits in some religious people's lives, and I wish I had that. I wish I had that community. I wish I had that confidence that allows me to sacrifice for others and do good, because I believe that there's a reward in coming ahead for that. And I think when we look at the practical outcomes in the lives of individuals, we will see that especially Christianity has a better outcome. Now, you may or may not believe that, and we could argue the facts, but for instance, here's another way to look at it. If you look at the freedom and prosperity of humans in the West, the free West, arguably the Christian West, or with our ideological foundations in Christendom, compared to the East, where ideas like atheistic communism, Islam, Confucianism, where these exist, you can see the quality of life is much different. Much different. Why is that? It's time to go read a book by Rodney Stark or two. We'll talk about him in the future. He's a wonderful historian who just passed and argues that the Christian view has led to the success of the West. So there are pragmatic reasons. If atheism, when scaled up to government, leads to a moral vacuum, which is then filled by the state as the new moral authority because God's not the moral authority, and then the next step is valuing the community above the individual, so human rights disappear and hundreds of millions of people die. Well, that sounds like an extreme story. Guess what? That's what's happened in history more than once. So the belief or disbelief in the existence of God has real pragmatic consequences in this world, not for the individual, for the society, and also, as Christianity often teaches, there is a life to come where we either inherit eternal life or are destroyed in judgment. Okay, so it is vital to know the answer to this question. All right, let's do 3 more principles of reasonable faith, or applying reason to testing faith, that Richard Swinburne did not give us, but they came from other books. All right, the first is that rational faith is virtuous, and having a faith that does not apply reason is a vice, or I would like to say a sin. Now, rationally supported faith is a virtue because it involves more than just mental assent. It involves the application of reason to test what we believe in our hearts. Irrational faith, even if it produces some positive ends, I believe it even though it's irrational and it makes me a better person. The goal is not just becoming a better person, right? If it's built on lies, it's going to collapse under pressure and have other negative effects where you are blinded from other things that are absolutely wrong and destructive that you believe. When we are not implementing intellectual integrity, falsehoods creep in and pollute our motives and the fruits of our efforts and leads us away from truth in general. And this can lead us and those around us away from health and liberty. Let's look at a couple comments from this wonderful book, The God of the Philosophers. I think, even though I have a featured book today, all of these books are wonderful, although a bit academic. I'm warning you, but they're really great. Here's what Anthony Kenny says in The God of the Philosophers. If the validity or invalidity of arguments for and against the existence of God is wholly irrelevant to faith, then faith seems a vicious habit of mind, a turning of one's back on the possibility of discovering truth. That is, you've got a disconnect between reality and what you believe about God. It's all one connected reality. Our ideas have to integrate, or we're not looking at reality properly. Well, here's another quote from the great John Locke, and you'll see he's a little hard to read, but it's along these same lines. He that believes without having any reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies. And I think we can just stop right there if we want to, because the rest of it's kind of complex. But let's keep going. He neither seeks truth as he ought, nor does he pay the obedience due his maker. Why? So he's disrespecting God by not employing reason in his faith. For he governs his assent right, that is, his mind is, okay, I agree, and places it as he should. However, he's not doing this according to reason, but he's doing it just according to trusting authority. And that's not always the best way to do it. All right. There is a place for trusting the authority of Scripture or the church or the scientists that came before you, but not in isolation to our other methods of reason, empiricism, and experience. All right. Well, again, here I mentioned this book earlier by Graham Oppy, Arguing About Gods. He's just such a wonderful philosopher. And I wanted to make an extra point about the use of rationality. You know, when I get into arguments with atheists, sometimes atheists will say, you have no logic at all. You've just abandoned logic. And I've heard Christians say that to atheists as well. You have you're not logical anymore. I can't talk to you. Now, we all make bad logical steps and arguments, but I want you to hear what Graham Oppy says about this, because I find him to be one of the most intelligent, articulate, and reasonable and kind philosophers I have read on this subject. This book, Arguing About Gods, is expensive because it's an academic book, but it's wonderful reading if you want to see somebody take the arguments for and against theism and then deconstruct them and show where they're both weak. Now that is a tough objective thing to do. But here's what Graham Oppy says, and I love this, and I wish we would treat each other better when it comes to the use of reason and faith. If one supposes, as I do, he writes, that there can be sensible, thoughtful, reflective, well-informed people who are theists. Oh my gosh, how many atheists would call someone who is a theist thoughtful, reflective, and well-informed and sensible? And similar atheists, I just put in similar because he repeats those same adjectives. If you believe there are atheists like that, which he does, it is perhaps not very surprising that one can also maintain there are similar agnostics. That is, those who suspend their belief on the question of whether or not there is an orthodoxly conceived monotheistic God. So what he is arguing here is that there are logical people on all sides of the argument, even those who have suspended belief and have not decided. It's not necessarily a moral or character fault that causes someone to believe, disbelieve, or not choose. So let's stop making ad hominem attacks and realize that if it was clear whether or not God existed, we wouldn't really be arguing about it except way off at some fringe. But the fact that this is still a central argument means that there are a lot of reasonable arguments that need to be considered on all sides. All right. Revelation is a valid form of knowledge, but should still be subject to reasoned justification. Well, remember, these are our four methods, and revelation falls into the categories of experience and authority. That is, in my experience, I may feel like I'm having a revelation, I'm having an epiphany, I'm having an awakening of truth. And revelation also comes through authority. That is, we believe in revealed truth, for instance, in the scriptures. So what this says is that just because we're approaching things with reason doesn't mean that revelation is illegitimate as a source of truth. It means, though, that we cannot decouple it from our other methods, especially reason. What happens is, there's a saying, I'm not going to do the saying. Anyway, I just want us to know that reason must be applied, but it is not the only arbiter, just like empiricism is not the only arbiter of what is true, but we must use reason to apply it to all these other inputs. All right. Number 7, revelation is a valid form of knowledge. Oh, this is still the same point, but I wanted to just give you a couple scriptures that talk about the role of revelation. And there's a lot of these I could do. I just chose a couple to be illustrative. But without faith, it is impossible to please God, for he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Isn't that weird? He that comes to God must already believe that he exists. So there is a role for illumination in finding the truth. That's what I'm saying here. And here's another one. We'll talk about this more when we get to experience. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Whoa. In this paradox, reason can clear the way for belief, but it can't create it. When the way is clear, and sometimes even when it is not, in the mind, revelation can speak to the inner man, that is our intuition and conscience, and birth belief. So faith always, in some sense, faith always precedes belief, but for us to ground the faith, we must have intellectually a clear platform to some extent. All that is to say is faith must be intellectually grounded in reason, even if revelation initiates faith. In practice, reason can only set the groundwork for faith and provide some intellectual grounding, but it cannot create faith. Therefore, neither faith nor reason exist alone in the life of the Christian. They cannot exist independently, right? Some would say, if you're all truth and no experience, you end up as Pharisee. If you try to have only experience and no truth, you end up as heresy. Okay, something like that. All right, got to have both. Last point, philosophy, that is reason, is primarily used to support or reject contentious claims. The main purpose of philosophy is not to argue against or for things that are clear, but actually for or against things whose truth is unclear. The existence of God, though perhaps self-evident in some ways, is still a matter of faith and not of uncontested knowledge. All right, so it's proper to apply reason to articles of faith. Reason must be applied despite its limits in order to at least separate obvious lies from possible truths. Now, along these lines, I just want to mention an atheist mistake that I see very often, and that is to say that all spiritual claims are equally dubious and untrue. In other words, you can't really tell the difference between the Christian claims about God and the claims about the existence of unicorns, or even the claims of the flying spaghetti monster. But that's foolish. And in a future podcast, we'll talk about how do we refine our examination of religious claims, and can we at least eliminate pretenders, even if we have a few contenders that may be left over, because it can't prove or disprove only one view, but it can certainly eliminate a lot of nonsense if we apply reason to evaluating religious claims. All right, well, there's our list we just went through, and let's just remember that we have these four that we're talking about. Next week, we'll talk about the major philosophers whose names start with the letter A. Okay, I just have four of them that all start with the letter A. And in chronological order, they are Aristotle, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, who actually picked up Aristotle again. So it'll be an interesting circle, but we want to talk about the role of reason. You know, we started out being very critical of reason with the podcast entitled "Reason is the Devil's Whore," which is a quote from Martin Luther in his criticism that reason apart from God is unreliable at best. And so we're going to examine the rest of these, but I'm actually warming up to reason. We started out kind of negative, and next week we'll see, when we get to Aquinas, his esteem and involvement of reason with faith is very high. And I think that's where I'd like to end up, as long as we understand that, like empiricism, reason has its limits, especially when it encounters some of the spiritual truths that cannot be clearly ascertained with reason. All right, here's the recommended book where I got most of these points from. This is Richard Messer. Interestingly, he on the back of the book, he's listed as assistant registrar at Reading University in Oxford. So he ended up going the administrative route, but he is an excellent and clear writer. He's an excellent and clear writer. And so I highly recommend this book. It is a little expensive. I got it at a used bookstore near me, so it wasn't $45. It's a little bit of a tough read, but it made Richard Swinburne understandable, which is a feat in itself. I really love his writing, and I just want to give you a sample of it and just talk about why it is good, and I think you'll appreciate that. The issue of God's existence is so important that it is unusually vital to hold a true belief about it. And one way of coming to hold true beliefs is by checking that rational justification is necessary for true belief in God. In Aquinas, for example, it is clear, so here he's quoting Aquinas, who's from the 13th or 14th century. It is clear that philosophical reasoning is not required for a genuine belief in God. So here he's not arguing, the author is not arguing that we don't need reason, but he's saying that Aquinas is saying that we don't need reasoning to have genuine faith. There's nothing to stop a man actually accepting faith which he personally cannot demonstrate, even if that truth is itself such that the demonstration could make it evident. And I'm sorry, I think I dictated that to my computer, and it didn't quite capture that properly. But what he's saying is that you can have faith without reason. But, of course, he's not recommending that. In fact, here's what the author goes on to say, and also if we followed Aquinas, we would go on and to see that he also disagreed with that. Modern thinkers such as Kenny and Mackey find it impossible that belief should not be susceptible to proof or disproof. For them, and this is not the case with many cognitivists, including Hick, Mitchell, and Planting, a rational justification is not only appropriate but also necessary. Religious belief is to have any genuine worth. Now, the reason I showed you this is not only because I think his prose is clear, although not as clear when you don't capture it properly with voice to text, but I like that he reviews the other thinkers and is explaining who they are to you. So that's pretty good. Now, there's a few other authors, which I just want to mention quickly, who I think are brilliant writers that when I read them, I go, oh, I can only aspire to write like that. And here they are. One of them is James D.G. Dunn, also an Oxford professor, brilliant theologian. And he's written a really, not only is this book, The New Perspective on Paul, excellent, but he's written a very good commentary on the book of Romans. Speaking of commentaries on Romans, this book by John Stott, if you're going to get a commentary on Romans, just start with this one. I have a whole shelf of them up there. I'm telling you, this is the one you start with. It is clear, it is accessible, it is generous towards other perspectives when he comes upon passages that may have more than one application. Love this guy. Another guy whose writing just gets right to my heart is this guy who I've just discovered, Vern Poythress. Vern Sheridan Poythress. What a name, huh? Poythress. That's just fun to say. This guy is clear and brilliant. Love him. Okay. Well, that's it. So I'm going to just do a closing prayer, and then we'll go to my favorite section, which is Confessions of a Podcaster, where I talk about how difficult this is to do and to do well and to get subscribers. And if you want to have a podcast, or if you're just interested in what goes on behind the scenes, you can stick around for that. God, thank you for the ability to speak to the internet. I pray that my use of reason would be proper, that it wouldn't bring you shame, that it wouldn't bring the gospel shame, but that I would properly employ reason in finding truth. Amen. All right. Well, here's what I want to say about this. And that is that initially I had to find a platform, which I'm using StreamYard. It seems to work pretty well. I know that there's some new platforms out there now. Rumble Studio, I don't know if that's openly available to everyone, but StreamYard seems to work pretty well, although I had to re-record today's podcast because I was having some weird slowdown, and I think it was because Windows in the background was waiting for me to restart after it did an update or something. So I redid all this. I'm still fooling with lighting. I've got a bunch of lights in here. It's really bright. Like I have to squint. So I want to get my lighting down, and it's a real challenge to get a nice looking, background. I tried a green screen, and it was too much work. I had to have it too close, or it had to be giant so you wouldn't see around the edges of it. Light shines through the cloth sometimes. It was a real weird hassle. But my biggest struggle is, of course, how to make useful content that people will listen to and share. I don't know how many people do long form videos or watch them. Now, if and when I turn this into a podcast, which is on my list of things to do, where you can get it on your phone and then listen to it while you're driving or whatever, that is on my short list. But figuring out how to do that easily takes a little bit of work. The next step beyond that is, people love short form. We're talking TikTok, 30-second type of videos that grab you. I don't know how to turn this. There's two ways to do that. One is to take your long form and split it up. And there's AI sites where you can upload your video, and it'll try to kind of, based on understanding the content, try to make little shorts for you that you can make for viral, publication. The other way is to design your podcast and your sound around the short form, right? Kind of like when you do software development, you design for mobile first, and then you move to desktop. There might be an argument for designing for virality first, things like adding subtitles, being more provocative, being more narrow and brief, and just bringing up one point that people can discuss rather than putting it within the context of a larger rubric. All that stuff is in the back of my brain. I've got a total of 15 subscribers this week, and not any live watchers except for perhaps my wife. But I am thinking about how do I make this useful so that people want to watch, they want to share, they want to participate. And there's a lot of channels on YouTube that will teach me to do that, and especially if I join their system and get ay. But it's not easy. And if you have any tips for me or want to help me figure out my lighting or how to go viral or how to design my content that's other than just the long form content of a lecture, please do. All right. Thank you for visiting me this week. And we'll see you next week when we talk about the philosophers whose names start with the letter A.